You think you've seen all the Jane Austen adaptations? Trust me, you haven't. The BBC spent 50 years turning her novels into TV dramas, and buried half of them under bad wigs, cheap lighting, and the occasional Roman bath hallucination. This is the full list, starting from the 70s, the good, the weird, and the ones Jane Austen herself would probably sue over. This one's a real gem, if you can get past the hair. Persuasion from 1971 is the only full miniseries adaptation of the novel, and it's probably the most faithful one ever made. It sticks to the book in a way no other version really has. You even get little moments from the novel that are usually skipped, like the Musgroves bringing a harp to Charles and Mary's house. That kind of detail is rare. Anne Furbank plays Anne Elliot, and yes, she was 38 at the time, which is quite a bit older than the 27-year-old character. But you know what? She's genuinely lovely in the role. She carries Anne's quiet strength, that emotional depth, with this calm kind of dignity that really works. Brian Marshall plays Wentworth, and he's absolutely excellent, gruff, wounded, and still very much in love. The production isn't perfect. The hairstyles are distracting. The costumes, especially Anne's, are often unflattering and feel more 1970s than Regency. But the filming is elegant. The pacing gives the story some room to breathe, and the whole thing is just quietly beautiful. This is an early BBC Color production, and it's definitely a bit rough around the edges, but there's a lot to enjoy here. Joanna David plays Eleanor, and she's absolutely wonderful. Calm, intelligent, beautifully expressive. You might recognize her as Mrs. Gardner from Pride and Prejudice 1995. Robin Ellis, who would go on to play Ross Poldark, is Edward Ferrars. He brings this charming awkwardness that really works for the role, and honestly, he's probably where Emma Thompson got the idea for that dithering, sweet version of Edward in her script. Now, it's not entirely faithful to the book. Margaret, the third Dashwood sister, is missing, and the version takes some liberties with character tone. Marianne, for instance, is played very over the top. There's even a scene where she says goodbye to the curtains at Norland. The costumes and hairstyles are very much of their time. Plenty of puffed-up 1970s hair, especially on the Dashwood sisters. But honestly, it's styled well enough that it doesn't take you completely out of the period. This one's a little uneven, but there's something cozy about it. It doesn't have the polish of later adaptations, and the production values are lower, but the performances have heart. This one's a bit of a slow burn, but it has its own quiet charm. Doran Godwin plays Emma, and while some folks might find her a little too old for the role or not quite as conventionally attractive as later versions, she's actually very close in age to the character, and she brings a lot of nuance to the performance. There's something really lovely in how this adaptation takes its time. 6 episodes, lots of room to let characters develop and relationships unfold. If you're used to the brisk pacing of more recent film versions, this might feel slow at first, but once you settle in, it's a very rewarding watch. The psychological depth is one of this version's biggest strengths. The story of Emma's growth, her blind spots, her misjudgments, her slow realization about her own feelings, is handled with care. The script stays close to the novel, and it really takes the time to explore the emotional beats. Visually, it's plain. There's not much in the way of stylized lighting or sweeping cinematography. A lot of it is shot indoors, with the exception of a few exterior scenes like Box Hill. It's very BBC in the 1970s, functional, simple, but that also keeps the focus on the characters and dialogue. This one came out a full 15 years before the famous Colin Firth version, and while it's definitely a bit more studio-bound and stiff in places, it still holds up surprisingly well. Elizabeth Garvey plays Lizzie, and she's actually a lot closer to Austen's original conception than either Jennifer Ely or Greer Garson. She's wise, restrained, still youthful. It's a really thoughtful performance. And the rest of the Bennet sisters are solid too. David Rintoul as Darcy is just as interesting. He's nothing like the brooding romantic figure most people think of now, but he's magnetic in his own way. A little colder maybe, but totally in line with the book. Sets are simple, but they look authentic. and the scenery really is gorgeous. The music fits perfectly, nothing overdone. Faye Weldon wrote the script and said she wanted it to be accessible for people who'd never read the book, but also a pleasure for longtime fans. And honestly, that's exactly what it is. This one really benefits from the longer runtime. It gets to include scenes that the 1995 film left out, like Edward Ferrars visiting Barton Cottage and Willoughby showing up to see Marianne when she's sick. Those little moments actually make a big difference, especially if you've read the novel. The casting is also much more age-appropriate compared to the 95 version. Eleanor and Edward actually look like people the novel was describing. Irene Richard and Tracy Childs play the two sisters, and their relationship feels so natural. You really get the emotional contrast between them, but also the deep affection and loyalty. That dynamic is so well handled here, and I actually think the 1995 version missed that entirely, especially the bit where Eleanor completely loses it by Marianne's bedside. That always felt off. Here, there's no overdone drama, and Mrs. Jennings is there, just like in the book. Edward is a believable character, and his relationship with Eleanor unfolds gently, with all the right notes. Much more convincing than Hugh Grant and Emma Thompson, who honestly looked like they were in different movies sometimes. Production-wise, it was filmed in Devon during a very wet summer, so all those rainy scenes are completely real. And the costumes, BBC was obsessed with getting them right. Everything lines up with fashion plates from the 1810s, and once you notice, you really appreciate the attention to detail. This is the one Austen fans always point to as the only truly faithful adaptation of Mansfield Park. It stars Sylvestre Letouzelle as Fanny and Nicholas Farrell as Edmund. And while the acting can be stiff at times, the script sticks so closely to the novel that it almost feels like you're watching the book play out. The production value isn't great, it was early 80s BBC after all, and the sound and picture quality definitely show their age, but if you're in it for the characters and story, it's absolutely worth your time. The costumes are clearly modeled on the old Hugh Thompson illustrations, and you can really see that in how Henry and Mary Crawford are presented. Lady Bertram is just as the book describes her, though her voice is a bit much. It gets oddly theatrical in some scenes. Locations are beautiful. Southerton and Mansfield Park both look exactly the way you'd imagine. There is one dodgy moment in Portsmouth with a fake-looking matte painting of ships, but that's really the only scene where the visuals don't hold up. No, it doesn't have the polish of the 1995 Pride and Prejudice, but for Austen fans who want accuracy and depth over slick visuals, this one is a must-see. This is definitely the weirdest Austen adaptation ever made by BBC. Technically, yes, it follows the main plot of the book. It's set in the Regency period, it's got all the right costumes, it even has some decent actors in the supporting cast, Googie Withers, Robert Hardy, though they don't get much to do, but that's where the normal ends. This thing is completely off the rails. You get bizarre dream sequences with Mrs. Allen sewing straight through her finger. At one point, Henry Tilney randomly sings a duet with some woman we've never met before. The wigs are ridiculous, the curls are out of control, there are feathers on everything. And whoever thought electronic music was a good idea for the opening credits needs to answer for that. It's a mess. A glorious, baffling mess. Some people call it a hate watch. Others say it's a must-watch because it's so strange. British critics, believe it or not, praised it at the time, called it a masterpiece. But for most Austen fans, this is the one you watch with a glass of wine and a sense of humor. Now this one is the good stuff. The 1995 BBC Persuasion with Amanda Root and Ciarán Hinds. Easily one of the most faithful and elegant Austen adaptations ever made. It won 5 BAFTAs, and for good reason. The performances are subtle, grounded, and completely locked into the period. Nobody's doing a modern wink to the audience or turning Anne Elliot into something she wasn't. Amanda Root plays her with real restraint and depth, and Ciarán Hinds is just perfect as Captain Wentworth. Warm, a little reserved, completely believable. It was all filmed on location using natural light, which gives the whole thing a kind of soft, lived-in atmosphere that feels incredibly real. Because of the limited budget, they ended up reusing shots of Captain Wentworth's ship from The Bounty, 1984, for the ending, but it works. If you love Austen or just well-done period drama, this one's essential. And for some reason, people still leave it out when talking about the best adaptations, which is ridiculous, because this one absolutely belongs at the top. This is the one, the gold standard, the one everyone thinks of first when they hear Jane Austen on the BBC. The 1995 Pride and Prejudice with Jennifer Ely and Colin Firth was a full-on cultural event. Even if you've never seen it, you know about the pond scene. It was smart, romantic, beautifully cast, and still holds up all these years later. Now, this wasn't the first BBC version. There were several before it, going all the way back to 1938. But producers Sue Birtwistle and Andrew Davies felt those earlier ones looked too stagey, too undernourished, and they wanted something with real cinematic energy. Originally, it was supposed to be 5 episodes, but TV scheduling made them stretch it to 6. And while they stuck close to the book, they also wanted it to feel fresh. That meant showing the Bennet girls getting dressed for the marriage market, or showing the men off hunting or playing billiards, scenes that Austen didn't write but that helped bring the world to life. Jennifer Ely, who played Elizabeth, was so good in the role she could have coasted on it forever. But instead, she turned down the fame and went straight into Shakespeare. Meanwhile, Colin Firth became a full-blown star, thanks to that performance as Darcy. And for anyone wondering just how faithful the series really was, director Simon Langton had the best answer. Director Simon Langton had the best response. If we wanted to be utterly faithful, we would have got someone to recite it over the radio. The real Jane Austen takes everything you think you know about Austen, the quiet aunt, the spinster in the corner writing books, and flips it right on its head. For years, her family helped build up this image of a sweet woman who lived for her relatives and stayed far from anything dramatic. But that version was carefully curated, mostly by her brother. This docudrama is based on Paula Byrne's book, A Life in Small Things, and it paints a much livelier, more fascinating picture. Austen as someone who loved theater, adored fine clothes, had close friendships, and enjoyed travel. Someone with opinions, ambitions, and a sharp mind for the world around her, not just a woman stuck in domestic life. The narration is by Anna Chancellor, who's actually Jane Austen's 6 times great-niece, and a direct descendant of her brother Edward Austen Knight. You might also remember her as Caroline Bingley in the 1995 Pride and Prejudice, which makes her involvement here even more special. The drama itself doesn't try to exaggerate Austen's life into something it wasn't. It works with what we know and just presents it honestly, with beautiful camera work, gentle pacing, and thoughtful editing. This one is quieter, more introspective, and beautifully done. Miss Austen Regrets draws heavily from Jane's letters and gives a more reflective look at her later years. It stars Olivia Williams as Jane, and she's joined by a fantastic supporting cast. Imogen Poots, Hugh Bonneville, Jack Huston, and even Tom Hiddleston pops up. What sets this film apart is how grounded it feels. It doesn't invent wild love stories or try to dramatize things beyond recognition. The writing sticks closely to Austen's own words, and while there's naturally some interpretation involved, it feels honest. It also gives rare attention to Cassandra Austen and Fanny Knight, which is a real treat for anyone familiar with the family. The film shows Jane watching her niece navigate proposals while reflecting on her own life and the choices she made. If you've seen Becoming Jane with Anne Hathaway, you'll probably appreciate this one even more. Becoming Jane took a lot of liberties, altered the timeline, added a love triangle, even made up a meeting with Anne Radcliffe just to have them chat about a man. It's charming in places, sure, but if you're looking for something closer to the real Jane Austen, Miss Austen Regrets is the one to go with. This 3-part adaptation is one of the stronger modern versions of Sense and Sensibility. It stars Hattie Morahan and Dan Stevens as Eleanor and Edward, with Charity Wakefield and David Morrissey as Marianne and Colonel Brandon. Morrissey is actually about 16 years older than Wakefield, which matches their characters' age gap in the novel, one of those small details that adds a nice touch of realism. There are moments that feel a bit rushed. Brandon's sudden disappearance from Delaford, for example, plays more abrupt than mysterious, and the ending wraps up a little too quickly. But overall, this one really captures the spirit of the book. The series is also visually stunning. From the opening shots of crashing waves to the use of candlelight in party scenes, everything feels true to the Regency period. The clothes, the soft furnishings, the landscape, all of it creates the right atmosphere. Based on P.D. James's best-selling novel, Death Comes to Pemberley takes place 6 years after Pride and Prejudice, and imagines what happens to Elizabeth and Darcy after the happily ever after. Anna Maxwell Martin plays Elizabeth, and Matthew Rhys is Darcy. The story kicks off as they're preparing for their annual ball. Lydia and Wickham show up, uninvited of course, and almost immediately, there's drama. Wickham storms off into the woods with his friend Denny, 2 shots ring out, and when they're found, Denny is dead and Wickham is hysterical, covered in blood. The show leans into the murder mystery angle, and the tone feels like a mix of Austen, Midsummer Murders, and Agatha Christie. It's definitely not trying to be a straightforward Austen adaptation. It's its own thing, just using the characters we know. Critics noted that it's respectful of Austen's world, but not afraid to be something totally different. And that's exactly what it is. A genre mashup that works best if you go in knowing it's a mystery first, Austen second,